The Copa room at the Sands Hotel glittered like a jewel box that night in 1962. Every table packed with men in tuxedos and women draped in diamonds that caught the stage lights like trapped stars. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, expensive perfume, and the electric hum of a crowd that knew they were sitting at the center of the universe. Frank Sinatra owned that stage the way a king owns his throne, his voice wrapping around the microphone with that particular brand of dangerous charm that made grown men lean forward and women forget their husbands' names. Dean Martin stood stage left, martini glass in hand, that sleepy-eyed smile playing at the corners of his mouth like he'd just heard the world's best private joke. He swayed slightly to the music, looking for all the world like a man who'd been born without a care, without a worry, without a single sharp edge that life could cut him on. To most people in that room, this was the summit of cool. Kings in cufflinks, flirting with forever. But every kingdom has a crack the light finds. It started small. It always does. One voice in the dark. At a table close to the stage, a man who had been drinking more bravado than bourbon kept pushing. First it's a loud request, then a louder insult. Maybe he wants attention. Maybe he wants to matter. In Vegas, it's hard to tell the difference. Frank tries to ignore it, that famous jaw tightening just a fraction. The band keeps playing. The room laughs nervously. Then the fan says the wrong thing about Frank, about respect, maybe about something private he read in the papers and mistook for permission to be cruel. The words don't just land, they stab. The fragile line between performance and reality snaps. Frank steps forward. The mic stand swings aside, his voice no longer silk but steel. There's a blur of movement, an argument, a shove. The audience gasps, half thrilled, half terrified. The band hesitates. The applause dies mid-clap. The magic shudders. Security isn't close enough yet. For a heartbeat, the Copa room is no longer a temple of cool. It's just a room full of strangers watching a hero lose control. And Dean Martin, the man everyone thinks is too drunk to stand straight, doesn't jump into the fight. He doesn't grab Frank. He doesn't play the clown. Instead, Dean does the one thing no one expects in a town built on noise. He chooses silence. He puts his glass down, steps out from the shadows, and walks into the middle of the chaos with something so simple, so quiet, that the entire room stops breathing. It ends the fight instantly. Dean Martin spent his life making the difficult look easy. But stories like this reveal the heavy cost of that cool. If you want to keep the memory of the true Rat Pack alive, consider supporting the channel by buying me a coffee using the link in the description. Your support helps us uncover these lost legends. Now, let's go back to that night in the Copa room at the Sands, Las Vegas, in 1962. On paper, it was a perfect Vegas night, the kind that glittered like a jewel box and made ordinary people believe in magic. The Copa room at the Sands pulsed with that dangerous electricity only money and fame could generate. Every table was packed with men in tuxedos and women draped in diamonds that caught the stage lights like trapped stars. The air thick with cigarette smoke, expensive perfume, and the intoxicating hum of a crowd that knew they were breathing the same air as gods. Frank Sinatra owned that stage the way fire owns oxygen, his voice wrapping around the microphone with that particular brand of dangerous charm that made grown men lean forward and women forget their husbands' names. This wasn't just entertainment. This was power made visible, charisma turned into currency, the kind of night that would echo in living rooms for decades. Dean Martin stood stage left in that half-world between performer and spectator, martini glass in hand, that sleepy-eyed smile, playing at the corners of his mouth like he'd just heard the world's best private joke. The audience saw what they expected to see, the lovable drunk, the sidekick who made carelessness look effortless. But if you watched his eyes instead of his glass, you'd notice something different. He was reading the room the way a sailor reads the ocean, sensing every shift in pressure, every change in the wind. The liquid in his glass was often apple juice, a secret he guarded like a diamond. Frank was the fire, raw and consuming. Dean was the water, the coolant in the reactor, watching everything with a clarity the world mistook for intoxication. At a table close to the stage sat a traveling salesman whose name history wouldn't remember, a man whose tuxedo fit too tight and whose laughter rang too loud. He'd started the night thrilled just to breathe the same air as legends, but somewhere between the third bourbon and the fifth, proximity to greatness had twisted into something darker. He wanted to be seen. He wanted to matter. In a room full of people who belonged, he needed proof that he existed too. It began harmlessly enough. A shouted song request, a too familiar "Hey Frankie," that made nearby tables smirk. Frank brushed it off with practiced charm, and the room laughed right on cue. That was the unspoken contract. They misbehaved. The boys smoothed it over. The illusion stayed intact. But some men don't recognize mercy when they're given it. The fan kept pushing. Each drink turned the volume up and the judgment down. The requests became commentary. The commentary became jabs about Frank's age, about his divorces, about stories he'd read in gossip columns and somehow decided gave him the right to touch nerves he didn't understand. The room began to tense, sensing the shift from playful to pointed. Then he crossed the line that couldn't be uncrossed. Something about Ava Gardner, said with a smirk that suggested he knew secrets he had no right knowing. The words hit like a physical blow. Frank stopped mid-verse. The band stumbled through 2 more bars before falling silent. The room held its breath as Sinatra stepped away from the microphone, his eyes locked on the man like a predator who just decided dinner was served. The mask of the entertainer didn't just slip, it shattered on the floor. His shoulders squared. The street fighter from Hoboken emerged, raw and dangerous. The salesman stood up, emboldened by alcohol and audience, not understanding that he'd just lit a fuse. Frank moved forward. Security was still 3 tables away. Too slow, too far. The audience fractured into those who leaned back in terror, and those who leaned forward in twisted thrill. In that breathless, terrifying moment, when a legend was about to destroy himself over a stranger's cruelty, Dean Martin made a choice that would define not just the night, but the man he truly was beneath all that, practiced cool. He set his glass down with the kind of deliberate care that suggested he'd been stone sober all along, and stepped into the light where magic and violence were about to collide. To understand what Dean Martin did in that moment, you have to go back to a place that smelled nothing like champagne and everything like survival. Steubenville, Ohio wasn't glamorous. It was steel mills and coal dust, broken English echoing through cramped kitchens, where his parents' words came tangled in Italian and fractured phrases that never quite fit right on the American tongue. Dino Crescetti grew up knowing what it was to be laughed at before he knew what it was to be applauded. Teachers mispronounced his name. Kids mimicked his accent. The world taught him early that sometimes the safest place to stand was just outside the conversation, where being underestimated became the only armor a poor Italian kid could afford. But Steubenville also taught him to fight, not just with his fists, though he learned that too, taking his lumps as a welterweight boxer for a few dollars a night in smoky gyms that reeked of sweat and desperation. He learned to read the room before the first punch was thrown, to calculate the cost of every move, to decide when to duck, when to parry, and most importantly, when to walk away. He pumped gas, dealt blackjack in illegal backrooms, worked jobs that left his hands smelling of metal and motor oil instead of spotlight and cologne. Every scar, every bruise, every quiet humiliation carved something into him, a private understanding of what it felt like to be on the wrong end of power, and an even deeper understanding that real strength moved quietly. The drunk act didn't start as entertainment. It started as camouflage. If people thought you didn't care, they couldn't break your heart when they proved it. If they believed you were always half gone, nobody expected you to be watching. The glass in his hand became part of the greatest magic trick in show business, usually filled with apple juice while everyone assumed it was vodka. He was a spy in the House of Fame, observing the chaos while pretending to be part of it. Behind the lopsided smile was a clockmaker's precision, a street fighter's instincts wrapped in a jester's costume. What the world never saw, what he made sure they couldn't see, was the pattern that defined his real character. 50 years later, a waiter named Eddie Russo would tell his grandson about the night Dean Martin made him matter, how he'd fumbled a drink order for Sammy Davis Jr., how the room had laughed, how he'd wanted to disappear into the carpet. Dean had called him over, ordered the most complicated drink on the menu just so Eddie could get it right, then tipped him $100 and winked like they were sharing a secret. Eddie kept that $100 bill in a frame until the day he died, never spending it, a reminder that someone had seen him when he felt invisible. There was the chorus girl who showed up with red-rimmed eyes, and a story about a producer who'd promised the world and delivered nothing. Dean made sure she was reassigned somewhere safe, that she went home that night with a little extra in her envelope and the number of a lawyer who owed him a favor. The extra on a film set whose daughter needed an operation, who found an anonymous check in his dressing room 3 days later for the exact amount. No note, no explanation, just help delivered in silence. Dean Martin had a profound, silent, allergic reaction to bullies. He knew what it felt like to be small in a room full of giants, and somewhere along the way, he'd made a private vow that nobody would feel that way on his watch if he could help it. He tipped busboys more than bosses. When a director tore into a crew member during rehearsal, Dean would stop the entire production with nothing more than a quiet word and refuse to continue until an apology was made. No headlines, no press releases. By the time anyone realized what had happened, Dean was already leaning against a wall, humming to himself like nothing had occurred. So when he stood in the wings of the Copa room that night, martini glass in hand, the world saw the mask they expected, the lovable drunk, the clown prince of cool. But inside, the boy from Steubenville was there too, the kid who knew what it felt like to be small, the boxer who'd learned to read the violence in a man's shoulders before it reached his fists, the street fighter who discovered that sometimes the best way to win was to let people think you weren't even playing. He watched that fan push and prod, watched Frank's jaw set and shoulders stiffen, watched the room tilt toward something ugly that would cost everyone more than they could afford. The glass in his hand was just a prop. The real Dean was stone sober, calculating the math of the moment, how many seconds until security arrived, how much damage Frank could do to himself in those seconds, how one wrong move could turn legend into tabloid tragedy. He wasn't seeing a celebrity spat. He was seeing two men about to destroy themselves over pride and ignorance, and the only adult in the room was about to step forward and find the third option nobody else could see. For a heartbeat, time in the Copa room didn't just slow. It fractured into 1,000 glittering pieces. Frank stood coiled like a spring, past the safe glow of the spotlight, his body leaning toward confrontation like a storm leaning toward shore. The fan, drunk on bourbon and borrowed courage, was on his feet too, chest puffed out in that clumsy way of men who'd never really thrown a punch, but had seen enough movies to fake the stance. Security was still weaving through tables, too slow, too far away. The room balanced on a knife's edge between spectacle and catastrophe. Dean Martin set his glass down on the piano with the kind of deliberate care that suggested every ounce of the drunk act had just evaporated into the cigarette smoke. He didn't rush toward the chaos. He didn't shout commands or crack wise to diffuse the moment. Instead, he moved through the frozen scene like a man navigating his own living room, treating violence and rage like furniture he simply needed to walk around. There was a straightness to his spine now, a clarity in his eyes that anyone really watching would have recognized as something almost dangerous in its calm. He walked past both men as if they were invisible, stepped up to the abandoned microphone, and with one small gesture, just a subtle tilt of his head toward the piano, signaled the band. The pianist caught his eye first, then the bassist, and within 3 heartbeats they were following his lead into something nobody in that room expected. Dean started to sing. Not a swing number, not one of the brassy crowd pleasers that kept the drinks flowing and the energy high. He chose something fragile, something that required the audience to lean in rather than lean back. His voice dropped to that register he saved for 3 in the morning, when the room was almost empty, and pretense had left the building. The notes came out soft, almost broken, like a man singing to himself in a dark room, and somehow that quiet honesty cut through the chaos more effectively than any shout could have. It was emotional alchemy. The room shifted, and you could feel it happen the way you feel a storm change direction when the wind decides on mercy. People who'd been half standing, craning to see the fight, found themselves settling back into their chairs. The energy that had been coiling toward violence suddenly had nowhere to go, except into the melody that wrapped around them like a blanket. Dean wasn't competing with the tension. He was absorbing it, transforming it into something the crowd could hold without getting cut. Frank's fists were still clenched, but Dean's eyes found his for just a fraction of a second. No words, just a look that said, "I'm giving you a way out, brother. Take it." And Frank, who'd built a career on never backing down, recognized the gift for what it was. Dean wasn't making him look weak. He was offering him a path back to being Sinatra the entertainer instead of Sinatra the street brawler, a chance to step into the role that made him immortal instead of the one that would make him tabloid fodder. The fan, suddenly stripped of his co-star status, deflated like a balloon with a slow leak. He wasn't being attacked or ejected or even acknowledged. He was simply irrelevant, a man standing in darkness while the real show continued without him. As security finally reached him, moving with quiet efficiency rather than force, Dean tracked the movement without missing a note. For just a heartbeat, as the man passed near the stage, Dean looked directly at him, not with anger or contempt, but with something closer to recognition. The smallest nod, barely perceptible, a gesture that said, "You're done now. Go home. Don't let this be the story you tell your grandchildren." It was forgiveness delivered in silence, a second chance given without fanfare, witnessed by no one except the man who needed to see it most. The last note hung in the air like incense, and then the room erupted. Applause crashed over the stage in waves, people rising to their feet, convinced they'd just witnessed something magical, without understanding they'd actually witnessed something miraculous. Frank's shoulders dropped, the violence draining out of him as he managed to smile and step back toward the microphone, the partnership restored, the illusion intact. Dean stepped back into the shadows, retrieved his glass, and that sleepy smile returned to his face, as if nothing at all had happened. The mask was back in place. The drunk was drunk again. But for those few who'd been close enough to see clearly, something had shifted in their understanding of what courage actually looked like when it wasn't trying to prove anything to anyone. They had just watched a man stop a war with a whisper, proving that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is sing a love song in the middle of a fight. The applause had settled back into the familiar rhythm of clinking glasses and hushed conversations, the Copa room resetting itself like a stage between acts. Frank was back at the microphone, voice effortless as silk, sliding into the next number as if nothing had fractured the perfect veneer of the night. Dean had returned to his spot stage left, one elbow hooked casually on the piano, that crooked grin suggesting he'd spent the whole interruption thinking of a better punchline. For the audience, the rupture had been papered over with melody and charm. For the two men sharing the spotlight, it had left a familiar, unspoken weight that only they could feel. The thing about Frank and Dean that the cameras never quite captured was how different they were in the spaces between the songs. Frank lived his life in capital letters, everything urgent, everything passionate, everything a battle for respect or survival. He burned hot and bright, carrying his wounds on the surface where they could bleed in public. Every slight felt like an attack on his soul. Every bad headline, every whispered rumor about the mob or the White House or the women he'd loved chipped away at him like water on stone. His rage wasn't just temper. It was the howl of a man who felt everything too much and couldn't afford to show weakness in a world that fed on it. Dean lived in the gray spaces, moving through the same dangerous world, but touching it differently, like a ghost passing through walls. Where Frank demanded loyalty, Dean offered acceptance. Where Frank saw battles, Dean saw misunderstandings that could be smoothed over with the right word, the right gesture, the right moment of perfectly timed indifference. Somewhere along the way, without either of them writing it down or saying it out loud, Dean had become Frank's firebreak, the man who absorbed the impact so the explosion never reached the audience. It wasn't weakness or passivity. It was a different kind of courage, the exhausting discipline of being the adult in a room full of talented children. On film sets, when Frank's temper flared at directors who pushed too hard, Dean would materialize with a joke that wasn't quite funny enough to be comedy, just present enough to redirect the energy. At parties, when Frank's eyes went cold and his voice dropped to that dangerous register, Dean would somehow end up between them, not confronting, just occupying space until the moment passed and everyone could breathe again. Tony Consiglio, one of Frank's bodyguards, would tell the story decades later with something close to reverence in his voice, how after a premiere, a photographer had gotten aggressive, shoving a camera in Frank's face while shouting questions about Ava Gardner. Frank had grabbed the camera, ready to smash it on the pavement, and the photographer was screaming about lawsuits. Dean had appeared from nowhere, gently taken the camera from Frank's hands and handed it back along with 5 crisp $100 bills. Then he'd looked at the photographer and said something so quiet that Tony couldn't hear it, but whatever it was made the man nod, pocket the money, and disappear into the night. No headlines, no lawsuit, just another crisis dissolved in silence, another night when Dean's wallet got lighter so everyone else could sleep easier. But carrying other people's chaos extracts a price that nobody sees until years later. Dean became so good at being the stabilizer that people forgot he might need stabilizing too. The cool that everyone admired wasn't just natural. It was constructed, maintained, performed even when the cameras were off. Because if Dean Martin ever actually fell apart, who would be left to hold the center together? There were rare moments when the mask would slip, when a director might catch him standing alone between takes, staring at nothing, his face carrying an exhaustion that had nothing to do with the work. But by the time anyone thought to ask if he was okay, that trademark smile was already back in place, and Dean was humming something under his breath like he didn't have a care in the world. Years later, Frank would do an interview where he called Dean the coolest guy who ever walked the earth. When pressed on what he meant, Frank had gotten quiet, that rare vulnerability crossing his face. He'd said that Dean had saved him more times than he could count, and the remarkable thing was that Dean had done it so smoothly that Frank hadn't realized he was being saved until years after the fact. There was something in Frank's voice when he said it, gratitude mixed with guilt, the uncomfortable recognition that the coolest guy in the world had paid a price for that cool that even Frank was only beginning to understand. In a cluttered attic in Bakersfield, California, in 2014, a grandson named Michael Brennan discovered that family mythology sometimes hides deeper truths in shoeboxes wrapped in tissue paper. The ticket stub from the Copa room was yellowed with age, dated March 1962, but what stopped his breath was the photograph beneath it, Dean Martin, cut carefully from a magazine, the edges worn soft from decades of handling, and underneath that, a letter his grandfather had written but never sent, addressed to no one in particular, the handwriting shaky like it had been written by trembling fingers trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. Michael had heard the story his whole life, told at family gatherings with the kind of embarrassed pride men sometimes wear when they want you to know they were once dangerous enough to have regrets. How Grandpa Joe had almost gotten into a fight with Frank Sinatra in Vegas. How he'd been drunk and stupid and lucky that security had thrown him out before things got really ugly. But the letter told a different story, one his grandfather had apparently never found the courage to speak out loud, even to himself. The letter described a hardware store owner from Ohio who'd saved for 3 years to take his wife to Vegas for their 20th anniversary. A man overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the place, by the money, by the proximity to legends who seemed more like gods than humans. The alcohol had hit him hard because he wasn't a drinker, just a nervous man trying to act like he belonged in a world that terrified him. The heckling hadn't come from malice, but from a desperate, clumsy attempt to be part of the show, to have Frank Sinatra acknowledge his existence, even if it was just to tell him to shut up. Joe had written about the moment Dean started singing, how the voice had cut through the bourbon fog like light through dirty water, how he'd suddenly seen himself from the outside, a traveling salesman in a borrowed tuxedo, picking a fight with legends because he was terrified of being nobody. The letter described Dean's eyes finding his for just a second as security led him away, and how that look hadn't been angry or disgusted, but something closer to understanding. Like Dean had seen this exact moment play out in 100 other men and knew exactly how the story ended if someone didn't intervene. That small nod Dean gave him wasn't a dismissal. It was permission to forgive himself. It was a silent message from one outsider to another that said, "I see you, pal. Go home. You're okay." Joe Brennan had quit drinking the next morning. Not dramatically, not with meetings or announcements, just stopped. He'd carried that Copa room ticket in his wallet for 52 years, a reminder of the night a stranger had given him a second chance without ever speaking a word. The photograph of Dean had sat on his bedside table until the day he died, and now Michael understood why his grandfather would sometimes stare at it with an expression that looked like gratitude mixed with something deeper, something that resembled grace. But Joe wasn't alone in carrying these invisible gifts. There was Marcus Washington, a former busboy who remembered the night Dean had quietly rescued him from a producer's public humiliation by ordering the exact wine Marcus had supposedly gotten wrong, then praising it loud enough for nearby tables to hear. 40 years later, Marcus's voice still broke when he told the story, remembering how Dean had winked at him on the way out, a small gesture that said, "You're going to be fine, kid. Don't let them make you small." This was the invisible legacy of Dean Martin, a ripple effect of small kindnesses that spread out from the spotlight and touched ordinary lives in ways that never made headlines. He moved through the world like a stone skipping across water, touching down just long enough to change the trajectory, then disappearing before anyone could thank him or turn his kindness into publicity. Somewhere in New Jersey, an old man had died with a framed Sands ticket on his nightstand and a photograph of Dean tucked behind it, carrying the memory of a night when the coolest man on earth had looked past his worst moment and seen something worth saving. History has a way of smoothing the rough edges off legends until they become something easier to package, easier to sell, easier to remember without the complicated weight of their humanity. When people think of Dean Martin now, they see a photograph with all the shadows edited out, the tuxedo, the martini glass catching stage lights, that sleepy smile that suggested he'd been born without worries and would die the same way. They remember the songs that made difficulty look effortless, the movies where he played versions of himself so charming you forgot they were performances. The world called him the King of Cool, a title that suggests a kind of Teflon detachment, as if he floated above the messy, painful realities of being human. But cool is a performance, and like all great performances, it hides the machinery that makes it work. The tragedy of Dean Martin's legacy is that the character he created was so convincing that we forgot there was a man underneath it, a man who carried fractures the spotlight never quite reached. The effortlessness was actually the result of immense discipline, a choice made every single day to absorb the friction of the world rather than add to it. The public saw the drunk, but his closest friends saw a man who often went home early, who sipped apple juice from a rocks glass, who left parties before the stories got too ugly. They saw the way his shoulders dropped when the dressing room door finally clicked shut, the way he would sit for a long moment in silence before taking off the mask that had glued itself to his skin over the years. Dean knew loss intimately, and that knowledge carved channels in him that ran deeper than any performance could fill. The death of his son Dean Paul in that airplane crash in 1987 broke something in him that no amount of stage magic could repair. Friends would say he aged a decade in a single year, that the light behind his eyes dimmed in a way that made the old footage almost painful to watch. He withdrew from the stage, from the cameras, from the carefully constructed persona that had protected him for so long, and spent his final years in a kind of voluntary exile that looked nothing like the carefree drunk the world thought they knew. The same instinct that made him slip anonymous checks into envelopes and diffuse fistfights with a song also made him protect the people who loved him from the full weight of his sorrow. The Copa Room incident became just another anecdote in the sprawling mythology of the Rat Pack, usually told as a funny story about Frank's temper and Dean's quick thinking, stripped of its deeper meaning the way all complicated truths get simplified over time. But for those who understood what they'd actually witnessed, it remained something different, a parable about a different kind of strength, one that our culture rarely celebrates because it doesn't shout. In a world that worships the loudest voice in the room, Dean Martin chose the quietest. In a culture that equates power with domination, he demonstrated that real power is the ability to de-escalate, to protect dignity rather than destroy it, to offer grace when everyone expects judgment. His true legacy doesn't live in the gold records or the Hollywood Walk of Fame star or the film reels gathering dust in studio vaults. It lives in the quiet corrections he made to the world immediately around him, in the lives of people who were allowed to walk away from their worst night with their humanity still intact because he quietly decided they were worth saving. Joe Brennan carried that Copa Room ticket in his wallet for 52 years, a reminder of the night a stranger had given him a second chance without ever speaking a word. Marcus Washington's voice still broke decades later when he told the story of how Dean had rescued him from public humiliation with nothing more than a wine order and a wink. These weren't publicity stunts or calculated gestures. They were the natural expressions of a man who understood that immortality isn't just about the songs that get replayed, but about the people who live a little differently because of a kindness they almost forgot to mention. Character over celebrity. That was the unspoken code Dean Martin lived by, even if he never articulated it. He understood that the applause would eventually fade, the lights would dim, and the only thing left would be how you made people feel when nobody was watching. The King of Cool wasn't just about style, it was about temperature. He lowered the heat in every room he entered. He made the world a little less angry, a little less sharp, a little more bearable for the people standing next to him. So perhaps the best way to remember him isn't as the drunk on stage with the perfect tan and the easy laugh. Perhaps we should remember him as he was in that breathless moment at the Sands, standing between rage and regret, holding a microphone like a lifeline, singing a love song to a room on the verge of violence. Somewhere, in an attic or a drawer or a fading memory, there are still artifacts of nights when Dean Martin changed the ending of someone's story with a gesture so small it looked like nothing at all. A ticket stub, a framed photograph, a letter never sent. Proof that the coolest man in the room was also, quietly, the kindest, and that his greatest performances were the ones that ended before anyone had a chance to applaud, in the seconds the cameras missed, where real life happened and real choices mattered, where a quiet hero made other people's chaos look effortless and then step back into the shadows like he wasn't carrying anything at all.